Welcome back to our series of online talks and lectures being organized by Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology, ASHA, along with its social media partner, Ganga Jamuni Heritage. We deal with Mughal sources each Friday while we discuss reflections on our shared past on every Sunday. Our endeavor is to put before you all not only our shared heritage and culture, but also how to approach our historical past through a scientific and secular approach by understanding our sources of information and how to analyze them. Today, our 13th lecture would be on language, state, and identity in Ardhakathanak, which would be delivered by my friend Professor Najaf Haider, who teaches at School of Historical Studies, JNU. Before I formally introduce him to our esteemed audience, and I presume that all of them know him already, he being a very popular scholar and a very erudite speaker, let me divulge that the whole series on sources germinated out of our wish to discuss 2 or 3 sources of Mughal period which throw much light on the existence of a society based on shared traditions. One of which was the Kathanak, which Najaf would be discussing with you today. The other two being Tazkira Pir Hassu Teli and the very well-known Zakhiratul Khawanin. But then, gradually we developed this series to include much more, and we started right from the Ghaznavite sources of the 10th century. Professor Najaf Haider, after completing his basic education from Patna, came to Aligarh, a place he left only after completing his higher education from there. He is counted as the last of the research scholars to be enrolled under Professor Irfan Habib's supervision. Subsequently, he was INLAC's Fellow, University of Oxford, 1990-93. He did his thesis on the monetary system of Mughal India. He started his academic career with a very brief stint at AMU's Center of West Asian Studies before being appointed as a lecturer of DU, where he was lecturer of Medieval Asian History, University of Delhi, 1998 to 2004. He then shifted to JNU, where now he is a professor and one of the well-known medieval historians there. He is one of the most traveled historians of our generation, and like Ibn Battuta, has been to almost all known happening places of the world. He also holds the distinction of being a visiting fellow at many foreign universities and institutions. He was visiting fellow at University of Bonn in December 2017, visiting professor at the Institute of South Asian, Tibetan and Buddhist Studies, University of Vienna in 2016. Erasmus Mundus Fellow, University of Vienna, 2014. Samir Shamma Fellow, St. Cross College, University of Oxford, 2013. He was also a visiting fellow at SOAS in 2008. He was also at Maison des Sciences de la Homme, Paris in 2007. Over to you, Professor Najaf Haider. I welcome you and ask you to deliver your talk on this very important topic. Najaf Haider.
Well, thank you, Nadeem Bhai, for those very kind words. And I'm very happy to be here to speak on a source of Mughal history with which I have long been associated in different capacities. And um, this opportunity is very welcome because this allows me to talk about the source as a whole, whereas earlier I was dealing with different aspects of it. Um, as most of you know, the Ardha is the first autobiography written in early Hindi. Also, first book written by a merchant. So it has two major distinctions. Banarsidas came from a family of state officials and merchants, and himself traded in medium value goods. He traveled for business, pilgrimage, and personal reasons and met many people. All this is discussed in the book. More importantly for us, he wrote. For all his compositions, the best for historians is the Ardhakathanak. He wrote other books like Nam Mala and Samaysar, Banarsi Vilas. This book he completed in 1641 AD. It's essentially in three parts, and then each part has sub registers. The first is what he calls Bansavali or Vanshavali, genealogy, where he discusses his ancestors and how they came and settled in Rohtak in Haryana, which comes down to a period when his father is uh, his father and his father's mother came to Jaunpur, 1556 AD. This, he says, is the real historical part, if I can use this expression, which is based on what he heard in his family and what he himself saw. The third and the thicker part of the book is, of course, when Banarsi is young and his early adolescence and then adulthood, uh, a total of 55 years of his life, which also gives the book its title. According to the Jain cosmology, the ideal lifespan of a human being was 110 years. And when Banarsi attained 55, he decided to, or just before that, he decided to write this book. And hence the title of the book, Ardh Kathanak, or half a tale, or half a story. Um, in between, I would like to recite passages from the book. Sometimes I can translate, sometimes you can understand if you read Hindi. There are different time intervals for which he gives very accurate dates. And this can be tested with external sources, and that is something which I really liked. So the first part is fuzzy, of course, and he says that if anything which I'm saying is not true, blame my ancestors who told me all the stories. But whatever I have heard or seen, I am going to write, and some of these events are very accurately described. जैसी सुनी बिलौकी नैन तैसी कछु कहूँ मैं बैन. So whatever he saw and heard, he says he's going to write. The space that is covered is large, from Rohtak to Bengal. But then there is a subunit which is more important, which is between Patna and Agra, in which Jaunpur, Banaras, and Patna forms one cluster where he spends a lot of time, and another is Agra, where he does business and also spends a lot of time. And there is, of course, Allahabad in between, where Kharaksan Sen, his father, was doing business, and he visits that place. So a lot of space is covered. He travels a lot and he meets people, and then he describes his experiences. Now, the language of the Ardhakathanak, according to Banarsidas himself, is the language of the Madhya Desha, which he does not define. And Mukundlat and others who have worked on the Ardhakathanak have tried to define this. Basically, it's the upper Gangetic plain, Bihar, UP, Delhi, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, and Rajasthan. And truly, the book is written in a mixed language. And therefore, Banarsi does not give it any name. The association of an unspecified language with a region is also found in the case of medieval Delhi, where in the beginning, that is to say during the Tomar and Chauhan period, Braj and Rajasthani were spoken, and then Persian, Punjabi, and finally a language called Khari Boli, which is the progenitor of modern Hindi. Now, Khari Boli was spoken in Delhi and Agra. As you can see, this Khari Boli, the expression itself is not really the name of a language, but there is a region which is specified and where it is spoken, and it's a mixed language. So very much like that, Banarsi's language of the Madhya Desha very deliberately is a language which people in this region could read and understand. It's interesting that Banarsi does not mention anything which he writes in his book based on reading, except for, of course, some reflections on his life and some philosophical ideas. But essentially, all the historical events, as well as events in his lifetime, are based on his personal experiences. Now, even though it's a mixed language, the language is mixed. The predominant registers are Khadi Boli, Braj, and Avadhi, the three dialects of Hindi, which Banarsidas was exposed to. Banarsi mentions that he knew Sanskrit, Prakrit, and what he calls Vivid Desh Bhasha, many different dialects. And one can find the reflection of all the three sources in this book. The language is, of course, spoken rather than written. And it is Banarsidas who gives this language a somewhat literary identity by writing his autobiography in this. The book has a huge Persian vocabulary. The Persian words used had entered, I suppose, by then the Hindi languages and dialect and had become integrated. Sometimes the words are very difficult to identify. And sometimes I'm sure people who were speaking did not even know that the word had come from Persian, because by then it had become part of the lingua franca. Words such as nafa, for profit, khazana, treasure, mal, money, sarrafi or sarraf, money changing and money changer, bazar, market, rozgar, dalal, which is an Arabic word for broker, and daru, which is a Persian word for gunpowder. Mukundlat has translated it as wine, but actually, if one reads the whole episode, it's gunpowder. There are technical, professional, and administrative terms like hakim, mir for amir, karkun, paik, khalisa, amal, muqim for appraiser of jewelry, sangtarash, stone cutters, etc. But my most favorite is a derivative, which is sariyat or sariyati, derived from shariat. Now we all know that shariat generally means Islamic law, but here it's used in a completely different sense. It's used as meaning administrative jurisdiction, and the first incident when this term is used is when Banarsidas reaches Itawa on his way to Agra, and there is a sarai which he couldn't get a place in because there were amirs staying or nobles. Then he went to the market and it started raining heavily and the night fell. He took shelter in a hut near the gate of the city along with two Shravaks. The people in the hut, chowkidars as he calls them, took pity on them and let them stay. But they warned them that in the morning, Shariati Khabri would come, men of the city administration who were meant to keep watch and gather intelligence, and they'll ask about you. The other incident in which the word Shariati is used in terms of jurisdiction or administrative jurisdiction, when a police chief, police official uh, tells Banarsidas that he has Sariyati over three villages. Teen gaon ki Sariyati kari. Which means here that he has administrative jurisdictions over these three villages. So it's a very interesting meaning that the term acquired in day-to-day language. I have a very strong belief that Banarsidas is not using the term on its own, on his own, and it is something that he has heard from the people who he is quoting, because he uses the formal equivalent of this term in Persian, which is amal, also. So he knows the difference. When he's discussing his father's revenue administration of four parganas of Bengal under the Sultan, the Bengal Sultan, he uses the word amal. So, which is the exact equivalent of administration. Now, it's possible to argue that Persian and Hindivi, a term which is itself a Persian language term for languages written in the Devanagari script, had very interesting interfaces, which this book brings out. And I'm going to talk a little about these interfaces. Now, there were varieties of bilingualism in Mughal India. For instance, there were people who could speak and write both Persian and Hindi, like Rizqullah Mushtaqi, who was a poet, both in Hindi and a writer in Persian. He wrote a book called Waqiyat-e Mushtaqi in Persian. His Hindi title, pen name was Rajan. And we know that he wrote two books, Jyot Niranjan and Pemayan, or Premakhyan as we call them, in Hindi. His Persian book has come down to us. So he comes across a person who could read both and write both languages, and it's very difficult to ascertain whether they could read Devanagari, because many Hindi writers like Dawood of Chandayan and Mushtaqi, and or authors of Madhumalti and Mrigavati, the two books quoted in Banarsidas, could read Devanagari or write in Devanagari, but they use the Arabic, Perso-Arabic script too. So the language itself is Hindi, but the script may be different. And some manuscripts of their works have come down to us in Devanagari and some in Persian. Now, about his grandfather Muldas, Banarsi writes that he had read Hindugi and Parsi, which is Hindi and Persian. Muldas was the steward or modi of a noble of Humayun in Malwa, in a place called Narwar. And he managed his master's cash and provision, and also gave out things on credit, apparently on behalf of his master. Now, Muldas could not have done this without keeping account of his transactions for the master. Khadak Sen Banarsidas' father joined the administration of a noble of the Bengal Sultan, Rai Dhanna, and was given four parganas. Rai Dhanna was the divan of the vizier of the Bengal Sultan, Lodi Khan, and he got two karkuns. Now, we know from other sources that during the Sur period, beginning from 1540, uh, two karkuns were appointed in each pargana, one keeping records in Persian and the other keeping records in Hindi or the local language. They were actually called in our sources Karkunane Farsi Navis, Karkunane Hindivi Navis. So it is very interesting that in describing Khadak Sen's administration, revenue administration, Banarsidas talks about these two Karkuns. Chances are that Khadak Sen too had the knowledge of Persian, without which it would have been very difficult for him to monitor how these two different records were being kept. I should also tell you in passing that this is in this period in which Khadak Sen is in Bengal, bilingual lexicons were written, the purpose of which were to instruct people in administration, particularly at the lower level of administration, to read both Hindi and Persian. In 1600, which is a kind of a tempestuous time period for the region of Allahabad and Jaunpur, which Prince Salim has become rebellious, and the air is full of different kinds of rumors and expectations. And the dwellers of Jaunpur, when they heard the news of Salim's impending, we know from a source which is not very we know that Salim gave the Pargana of Jaunpur to one of his nobles without Akbar's permission. And this noble, Lala Beg, who became a confidant of Jahangir when he became the king, came to Jaunpur. Banarsidas has the story from ground up, what happened. And in this story, everybody is worried. The Fajdar of Jaunpur is Nur Kilich, who is a Central Asian noble, a Turani noble. They all go to Nur Kilich, and Banarsidas reports a conversation between them, in which he told them he understood their dilemma, and also told them that he was facing a near-death situation, and was therefore hardly in a position to give them any assurance. So they should decide what they want to do. Let me read out the passage. Banarsi is talking about the people of Jaunpur, including his own family. क्या कीजिए अब कौन विचार, मुश्किल भई सहित परिवार, रहे न कुशल न भागे छेम, पकड़ी सांप छछुंदरी जेम. The dilemma, whether to leave or whether to stay. तब सब मिली नूरम के पास, this is Nur Kilich Khan, called Nuram popularly. गए जाए कीनी अरदास, नूरम कहे सुनोरे साहू, भावे यहाँ रहो के जाओ. I know that you are thinking whether to stay or go. मेरो मरण बन्यो है आई, मैं क्या तुमको कहूँ उपाय. I am myself facing a dangling between life and death, so what can I tell you? तब सब फिरी आए निज धाम, भागहु जो किछु करही सो राम. So then they came back and decided to leave. Now I am imagining, and since we have only this source with us, that this conversation was held without the intervention of an interpreter or a dubashya, and that they could both understand each other. Uh, Either Nur Kilic could speak in a language laced with Hindi and Persian, which they could understand, or some of them, like Muldas and Khadaksen, could understand a bit of Persian and could also translate. Banarsidas mentions his education under Pandit Devdutt and a Jain scholar Bhanchand who came to Jaunpur. And we know that it is from these two scholars that he gathered the language of Sanskrit and possibly Prakrit. He does not mention anything about learning Persian, as he did about his grandfather Muldas. Now, the evidence of his knowledge of some form of Persian comes from his meetings with the Faujdar of Jaunpur, Chin Khalij Khan, who is related to Nur Khalij Khan. Chin Khalij Khan was the son of a high ranking noble of Akbar and Jahangir, Khalij Khan. Uh, Nur Khalij was the son of his Khalij Khan's elder brother, and Chin Khalij Khan, who was the Faujdar of Jaunpur in 1615-16, Banarsi went to meet him. He describes how uh, there is a hint of a suggestion that they met in mysterious circumstances. But he started going to him, and they grew some kind of fondness. Khalij Khan gave him gifts, like in Banarsi's version, Sirpao or Saropa, which is a kind of a head to toe khilat, or robe of honor, and other gifts. But Banarsi was reading Nammala, in a dictionary of Sanskrit terms, Chandkosh, book of Sanskrit poetics, and Shrutabodh, also a book of poetics, with him. Now, it would have been difficult for Banarsi to explain the meaning of Sanskrit words or communicate the principle of Sanskrit poetics to a Persian and Turkish speaking noble without the knowledge of Persian. So, I am assuming that even though the knowledge of Khalij Khan's knowledge of Hindi was limited, and Banarsi's knowledge of Persian was limited, it was possible for them not only to have casual conversation, but also to talk about serious subjects related to language and poetry. Finally, there is an episode in which we know definitely that Banarsi could understand Persian. This is a conversation between two Mughal officials, which we are going to talk about in some detail later, which Banarsi could. It was a serious conversation. Some kind of a life and death situation for Banarsi in this case. And Banarsi was listening, and he reports the conversation. So obviously, and we can go into the discussion of how he managed to pick Persian during his business ventures and meeting with people, etc. But this is my intention here is to look at the possibilities which the book raises of reading interfaces between Persian and Hindi. Now, the second theme of our discussion is state. And you may have gathered by now that state is present in the background. Banarsidas himself did not have anything to do with the Mughal state or Mughal administration, unlike his father and grandfather, who were state officials. Muldas was employed by a noble of Humayun, but When Sher Shah drove Humayun out of India, Malwa was lost too. So chances are that Muldas says master, which who Banarsi calls Mughal, and I am assuming that he's a Turani or Central Asian, uh, remained in Malwa, and so did Muldas. But the first brush and the first um, event of any consequence that he discusses is the death of Muldas uh, and confiscation of his house and property by his master, the noble. Now, this is a practice which we are familiar with. In Mughal India, there was an standing principle that whenever a state official died, his property was confiscated immediately, and an entire inventory was done. Then, since all Mughal officials had state resources at their disposal, uh, the amount which the deceased official owed to the state was deducted from his estates, and the rest was distributed uh, among his heirs. Now, in this case, unfortunately, if we go by Banarsi's version, this did not happen. Moldas's house and property were both confiscated, and Khadak Sen, Banarsi Das's father, who was 5 years old, and Khadak Sen's mother, Banarsi's grandmother, were driven out of the house and became totally indigent and destitute. Let me see if I can read this for you. बारिश चारी जब बीते और तब सू करे उद्यम की दौर. No, just a second. This happens later. Just a second. Yes. खड़क सेन सूत माता साथ शोक व्याकुल भय अनाथ मुगल गयो था काहू गांव ये सब बात सुनी तिस ठाव आयो मुगल उतावलो सुनी मूला को काल मुहर छाप घर खाल से कीनो लीनो माल. So the moment the Mughal noble heard about the death of Muldas, he hurried and came and literally put his stamp or muhar on the house and included it in his khalsa. Khalsa, as we know, is central treasury. So either it was attached directly to the central treasury or it became the khalsa of the noble, which of course brought Muldas brought Khadak Sen to Jaunpur, where Banarsidas was born. So this is an episode in which there's a direct impact of state employment on the livelihood of the family as well as the bad days that they saw. There is also an interesting episode, three episodes about how Jaunpur was being terrorized and by Mughal officials. By Khalij Khan, who was looking after this part, particularly Allahabad, but also this part, had Jagirs in Jaunpur. He was the father-in-law of Prince Danial, who was given the viceroyalty of Allahabad. So Khalij Khan was powerful not only because he was a high-ranking noble, but also because he had Jagir. And of course, when you have Jagir in a region which has a city, which has a professional group, particularly jewelers and rich merchants, then of course, if you want extra money, you can always extort, and there are incidents of money being extorted by Khalij Khan and subsequently by another Jaunpur official Agha Noor. Luckily, these episodes were few and far between, and each episode did not last too long, so like 1 month or so, and then they came back. The usual thing was for people to flee the village and take shelter in other villages, or even in one case in a forest. So these episodes also tell us how even though the state was not directly impinging on their lives, there were incidents in which the family was affected. Salim's impending invasion in 1600, I have already discussed, and there's a long description of how the whole place was fortified by the local, um, just a second, local Faujdar, Nur Kilich Khan, and so I would like to read, if it's all right, a couple of passages from this. Mm, बरस एक लौ बीती छेम आए साहब शाही सलीम. This is 1600. बड़ा शाहीजादा जगबंद अकबर बादशाह को नंद आखेटक कोल्हूबन काज बादशाह की भई आवाज हाकिम यहाँ जौनपुर थान लघु किलीच नूरम सुल्तान. So Banarsi also tells us that the Fajdar of Jaunpur was called Junior Kilich or Laghu Kilich, which is quite accurate. ताही हुक्म अकबर को भयो साहिजादा कोल्हू बन गयो ताते सो किछु कर तू जेम कोल्हू बन न जाए सलेम. So this is a local story which is not found in chronicles, that Salim wanted to go for hunting, and as we know from many incidents, sometimes invasions are masqueraded as hunting expeditions. And Akbar is telling the Fajdar of Jaunpur, his official, not to let him come. ए विधि अकबर को फरमान शीश चढ़ायो नूरम खान. We also know that it was customary for the local official to touch the farman or put it on his head. It's a reference to that. एक विधि अकबर को फरमान शीश चढ़ायो नूरम खान तब तीन नगर जौनपुर बीच भयो गढ़पति ठानी मीच. So it's fortification. जहां तहां रुधि सब बाट नाव चले न गोमती घाट पुल दरवाजे दिए कपाट कीनो तिन विग्रह को ठाट राखे बाहु पायक असबार चहु दिसी बैठे चौकीदार. This is the Jaunpur Fajdar fortifying the city. कोट कंगूरे रखी नाल पुर में भयो ऊंचला चाल करी बहुत गढ़ संजोवनी अन्न वस्त्र जल की ढोवनी, stocking of provisions in the fort in case of a siege. जिरह जीन बंदूक अपार बहु दारू नाना हथियार. So you can see that the word daru, which is a Persian word, means gunpowder, which is stocked along with weapons. So this is where the city is directly affected by the news and by a possibility of confrontation. खोली खजाना खर्चे दाम. This is about the फौजदार. भयो आप सन्मुख संग्राम प्रजा लोग सब व्याकुल भय भागे चहु और उठी गए महानगरी सो भई उजार अब आई धार. अब अटैक हुआ सब जौहरी मिले एक ठौर नगर माही नर रहियो ना और. And then, as I read out earlier, they went to Nur Kilich and asked what to do, and he threw his hand in despair and said, look, I can't do much because I'm in a bad shape myself. The most famous incident concerning the Mughal state is, of course, it's a very well-known incident. People have written about it. Is Banarsi's reaction to Akbar's death in 1605. The news came. He was sitting in on the stairs of his courtyard. The news came, and he became very distraught, and he fell from the stairs and hit his head. So much so that he started bleeding, and his mother and father and family members became very worried about him. His mother quickly burned a piece of cloth and applied on his wound and put him on a cot, and then he rested. I'm going to read out very quickly from this. Sambat 1662. These dates are very accurate. Believe me, I verified many of these dates. This is very well known, of course. Ayo Kartik Pavas Natha, Chhatrapati Akbar Shahi Jalal, Nagar Agre Kino Kal, died in Agra. Ai Khabar Jaunpur Ma Praja Anath Bhai Binunath. पूर्जन लोग भय भयभीत, हृदय व्याकुलता और मुख पीत. मुंह पीला हो गया और the heart started pounding. अकसमात बनारसी सुनी अकबर को काल, सीढ़ी परी बैठियो हो तो भव भरम चित चाल. आई तवाला गिरी परियो सख्यो न आपा राखी, couldn't control himself, फूटी भाल लोहू चलो, कहो देव मुख भाखी. मुंह से आवाज निकली, oh God. But this is about Banarsi. So Banarsi, the interesting thing about this book is that Banarsi talks about his personal experiences, but then also goes outside and discusses what is happening in the city and sometimes what is happening in the region. इसी बीच नगर में शोर भयो उदंगल, चार ही ओर घर घर दर दर दिए कपाट, सारे दरवाजे बंद हो गए, हटवानी नहीं बैठे हाट, and shops were shut. भले वस्त्र अरु भूषण भले, this is something very interesting, ते सब गाड़े धरती चले तले, हुंडवाई गाड़ी कहूं और नगदी माल निभ्रमी ठौर. So people started burying the valuable things. Kapde, bhushan, ornaments, their ledgers in one place and cash in another, not in the same place. Then people started wearing coarse cloth, and not women and men were not going out wearing expensive things. With very interesting implication. ऊंच नीच को न पहचान, धनी दरिद्र भय समान, चोरी धारी दिसे कहूं नाही, यों ही अपभय लोग डराही. So people were apprehensive कि कहीं चोर डाकू तो नहीं दिख रहे हैं. Well, the translation in Mukul Nath is slightly different here, which is that they were worried unnecessarily because there were no thieves or bandits. But that's not what Banarsi is saying. Banarsi is saying that people were actually apprehensive and looking out, because this is the time, as we know now and then, that people with evil intentions come out, and you have to watch. Then immediately the news came, chitti aayi, that Salim has assumed the throne and everything was peace came back to Jaunpur, and so did the people who had fled. The final episode of Banarsi Das's brush with the state is something which I am going to take up in the last of my the theme of today's discussion, which is identity. And I'm not going to take much time. I know I have something like 5 minutes, but I'll very quickly raise again possibilities of reading a very difficult concept called identity in Banarsidas's autobiography. Now, it's a well-known fact that identity is based on difference, but that's not true. Identity in Banarsidas is based on sameness. You are equal to something, and that is your identity. If you are different from what you are saying you are, that is not your identity. So clearly, identity here is based on sameness. And of course, difference reinforces this identity, what we call alterity. Alterity and identity go hand in hand. The first identity which we come across in Banarsi is religious identity. He was a Jain from Shrimal caste, and he mentions it very many times. And the assertion of this identity is takes place in pilgrimages to Banaras, where there were temples of Parshavnath, and also to Samet Shikhar near Hazaribagh, which is a major place of pilgrimage for Jains. Rituals, reading of Jain literature, and of course, most importantly, the philosophy of happiness and sorrow as one cosmic whole. This is a very interesting refrain in Banarsidas. Banarsidas has framed many events in the Ardhakathanak based on this, which is derived straight from the path known in Jainism, path known as Samayika, the doctrine of practicing equanimity before both joy and sorrow. And he says this in one, if I can read out to you in English. He says, a poet would wonder upon his condition and say, while Kalich gave him sorrow in Jaunpur, where is he got happiness in Shahzadpur? From one point of view, sorrow and happiness are entirely different or opposite. But this is the point of view of those who do not know the secrets of the universe. Mood, Murk, he uses these expressions. From another point of view, the two are inseparable and part of a single experience. Only those who have experienced sorrow would know the pleasure of happiness, and vice versa. He who takes pleasure in happiness and becomes unhappy when sorrow comes is a fool who thinks that the two are different. So, very interesting philosophical. I'm not saying that Banarsi himself practiced this. In fact, a very interesting fact about the Ardhakathanak is that Banarsi is condemning himself for not being what ideally he should have been. And he uses devices to do that. So when he is criticizing people here as Moor and Murk, he is actually talking about himself. And he does not hide his failings. And in fact, it is possible to piece together evidence to reconstruct those aspects of his life which are totally in violation of the philosophy which Banarsidas had learned and thought of putting into practice. Another interesting identity is association with place. And this we all know very well. In Babur's memoirs, a person comes and tells him that he is from Andijan, and Babur, or he's using the epithet Andijani, and Babur asks him, why does he do that? He's not from Andijan, he's from a different place, implying that people should not use names of the cities in which they had not lived. But we also know that many people were born and brought up in one city and traveled in another and lived their life and assumed the name of that city. In the case of Banarsidas, it was very interesting. Banarsi was born after 8 years of the marriage and two pilgrimages to a deity, um, and in one pilgrimage the family was robbed. So Banarsi laughs at them कि गए थे बेटा का वो लेने blessings और लुट पिट के वापस आ गए. So when Banarsi was born, he was taken to Sammet Shikhar, and the priest there put him in the feet of the Lord and said, and then Banarsi's description of this is very interesting, but I'm sorry, I don't have time to read. He says the priest closed his eyes and pretended that he was having a vision. When he opened, he said, "I
Excuse me,
had."
Professor
Yeah.
Najaf Haider, you have enough time. You have time. So, you go
Oh,
ahead, please.
all right, all right. Thank you so much. Thank you. So Banarsi says that the priest closed his eyes and sat there like that, in Banarsi's own words, pretending that he was having a vision. And when he opened his eyes, he said, "You don't have to worry about this boy, this child. A yaksh of Parshavnath had come into my dream, and the yaksh said that give this boy the name of the city where I was born, and Banaras." And the family was very happy and said, "Okay, so be it. He is going to be called Banarsi." His name was actually Bikramajit. That was the name that was given to him at the time of birth. But this was rechristening of Banarsi Das based on uh, both religion and place. The two identities, in fact, uh, get united. Caste identity is another very interesting identity that is being uh, that is visible in the autobiography. All kinds of castes with which Banarsidas has had interactions. His own family, and by caste I also mean subcaste and gotra. So he calls his father Biholia, which he says is a gotra, because they came from a village, Biholi, in Rohtak, and the rulers, they were actually Rajputs, who became Jain, who got converted to Jainism, and since they were the protectors of the village, they got the name of the village as their gotra, and that's why they were called Biholia. And he calls his father Khadaksen Biholia. He also calls himself another Shrimal, which is another a higher caste identity, if you like. Um, Terms such as Bamhan for Brahman or Mahesuri, and other terms are used, caste terms are used for identifying people. Professional identity is something which is visible much more than any other identity in this book, and I would like to um, um, mention three incidents very quickly. The last is something that I promised I'll talk more about, and that I will. On three occasions, Banarsi was asked the question, "Who are you?" Uh, एक पुरुष बोला तुम कौन? This is when Banarsi has taken shelter in a house in a jhopri in Itawa, and there are chowkidars who ask this question, "Who are you?" The other time that he's asked this question is when he's traveling from Agra to Patna with his friend Narottam and his friend's father-in-law, a party of three, and the fourth person was a coolie, a bojia, who was carrying their potli. And they rested in a place, and Banarsi writes that in the middle of the night they got up and thought it was dawn. He calls it Makar ki Chandni, um, which is supposed to be, the moon is supposed to be very bright. So the moonlight was mistaken as brightening of the dawn, and they started their journey and got lost and met somebody who Banarsidas, of course, these are all flashbacks, so Banarsi can sometimes place what he came to know later beforehand. So he says this was the Chaudhry of a village of thieves. And he asks them this question: who are you? The third time that he's asked this question is when the two Mughal officials ask um, three people, Banarsi and two of his travel companions, the same question: who are you? So I'm using this very simple methodology of reading these three questions in different contexts, and Banarsi's response and other people's response to this question, and close my presentation here. And of course we can discuss. I'm not going to derive some very philosophical uh, argument from this. As I said, this is the beginning of a study of uh, the issue of identity, and therefore it has to be very simple and comprehensible. So in Itawa, the guard sitting in the hut asked Banarsi, who are you? 297, in case people have the book, and the verses are the same everywhere. In Mukundlat, in Rohini Chaudhary, if you have the verse number, then you can easily. तय बूझे तुम कौन हो, दुखी दीन अनाथ, was Banarsi's response. 300 कहें बनारसी, हम व्यापारी लोग. So that is his first response. We are merchants, which is very safe. We are strangers. You don't know us. You have never seen us in this, because we are merchants and we have come from a different place. And merchants travel. And merchants are innocuous and harmless. So there's no problem with them. 300 कहें बनारसी, हम व्यापारी लोग, बिन ठौर व्याकुल भये, since there was no place in the sarai, फिरें करम संजोग. And then उन चौकीदार के दिल में उनके लिए रहम आया, and they said, okay, you stay here. And they stayed. And then this very interesting, again bearing on identity, verse. फिर क्या कहा चौकीदारों ने? औरों सुनो हमारी बात, सरियती खबरी भय प्रभात. सुबह में सरकार के लोग आएंगे, बिनु तहकीक जान नहीं देही. Unless you verify your identity, they will not let you go. तब बख्शीस देहू सो लेही. Also revealing a state secret of Mughal India, that if you bribe them, they will let you go. Luckily, Banarsi and his friends woke up very early in the morning and joined the caravan, which was camping outside the city. So this is the first episode in which their identity was asked, and Banarsi's response was that we are merchants. Of course, he came from a family of merchants. He was a merchant himself. His father, Khadak Sen, was a merchant. He was first a state official, but then he started his own business. His Bade Nana, Madan Singh Shrimal, who gave shelter to young Khadak Sen, child Khadak Sen, and his mother was a jeweler or Johari in Jaunpur. And of course, so the identity was clearly very much his own. In the second case, when they were walking in the night, a man appeared and asked them, "Who are you?" And Banarsis writes that he became very scared. Either when he started, he was told that there would be a village of thieves there. I don't know. I doubt that. I thought that when he finally reached his destination or the next station, he was told. He said, "I was very scared and I started reciting shlokas in the manner of a Brahman." And the man was impressed and immediately said that, "Oh, you are Brahmins. I am your servant. Please come to my village and rest in my chopal. Uh, and in the morning you can go." So Banarsi, Narottam, and Narottam's father-in-law, the Bojia, had already fled, throwing the baggage, the bag on the boja on the ground and left. So these were three. The three then pretended to be Brahmins. After reaching the village, they quickly spun four yarns or janeos, which they put on themselves, and the fourth one they kept visible. Uh, of course, nobody would know that there were sacred threads inside, but if the one is visible, then perhaps people would know. They also took some clay and put water in it and put the sacred mark or tilak on their forehead in the manner of Brahmins. So now the disguise was complete. And they had conversations. The night passed. And in the morning, the Chaudhry of the village, came with his men, all on horseback, and said, "Come, we will show you the way." They showed them the way and stopped at a point saying, "Look, we cannot go beyond this point. But you see that that path will take you to Fatehpur. And of course, from there you can continue your journey." Now, you can say that this is a case of deception. To save life, they Banarsi assumed with quick thinking an identity was which was sacred, um, which people. The first response of the chief of thieves was, "Tum Narayan, hum tumhare das," and some other interesting ways in which he showed his obeisance and accepted that authority of the Brahman. But the reason why I thought I should discuss this was that people could switch identities, either for good or bad reasons. And this is a case of that. More can be discussed later if you have questions and comments. Now, my final point is about an episode in Banarsi's life which is memorable, both to the writer and the readers, which in a sense brings together the three themes that we have chosen: language, state, and identity. Banarsi is traveling from Jaunpur to Agra to close a partnership arrangement, which could only be closed when he signed. He had actually said in the beginning that there was no need for me to come, and you can consider the partnership closed. But the Sahu, Sabal Singh, wrote to him twice that no, this partnership cannot be closed without your presence. So he traveled, and he came to uh, with servants and a horse, um, Turangam and Nafar, and reached a place called Ghiswa, possibly modern Machli Shahar, where he met another party of a merchant, a Kothibal, whose name he frequently cites as Mahesuri, also with servants. And they joined, the two groups joined in the form of a caravan, and uh, decided to travel together as caravan and not as scattered individuals. Um, this, of course, was for the sake of protection. Caravan, was a medieval, a pre-modern um, institution of in trade and commerce, where people, particularly merchants, of course, other people also traveled in caravans, but particularly merchants who carried valuables, traveled, and the bigger the caravan, the better. Sometimes the caravan also hired uh, soldiers to protect them. But little did they know that this particular identity of traveling in a caravan would put their life in big danger. They reached a place called Korra Ghatampur near Fatehpur, and they stayed in a sarai. The Mahesuri party had two Brahmins who were going to Mathura and had joined his caravan. The Brahmins wanted to go to the house of a prostitute, and in order to bring gifts for the prostitute, phal mithai, they changed money. Now, in Mughal India, you cannot go to a shop and ask for something and pay in silver coin and ask for change, something that we are experiencing now. You can't do that. You have to give the exact change in which the price is quoted. So what do you do if you have a silver coin and the price is quoted in copper or dam or paisa? You go to a money changer. The money changer will change the rupee into copper coins, 40, 50 copper coins, charge a small commission, and you can then buy your things. So they went to a money changer, a sarraf, who changed rupee into copper coins. They bought whatever they had to buy, and they went to the house of this woman who is identified as Ahiri. So I'm going to read out verses from this. एक तुरंगम 9 नफर लीने साथी बनाई, नाउ घेसुआ गांव में बसे प्रथम दिन आए. The first day we stopped in a village named Ghiswa. ताही दिन आयो तहां एक और असबार सवार, कोठी बाल महेश्वरी बसे आगरे बार. शट सेवक एक साहब सोई, मथुरा बासी बांभन दोई. नर 19 की जुड़ी जमाती पूरा साथ मिला इस भांति. कियो कॉल उतरी एक ठौर, उन्होंने कॉल किया कि एक जगह रुकेंगे और उतरेंगे. कोऊ कहूं न उतरे और, चले प्रभात साथ करी गोल, खेलही हंसी करही कलोल. गांव नगर उलंघी बहु, चली आए तिस ठाव, जहां घाटमपुर के निकट बसे कोर्रा गांव. उतरे आई सराय में करी आहार विश्राम, मथुरा बासी विप्र द्वय, Pipra is the term used for Brahmins. Gaye ahiri dham. दुह में बाभन एक उठी, गयो हाट में जाई, 1 रुपया काढ़ी तिनी, पैसा लिए भनाई। आयो भोजन साज ले, गयो अहीरी गे, फिरी सर्राफ आयो तहां, कहे रुपया ए, गैर साल है बदली दे. Now, when they were having a nice time, the Sarraf appeared and said, this is a counterfeit coin. Gair Sal, which is a very interesting compound expression. Gair is Farsi and Sal is from Taksal. Gair Taksal ka paisa yani counterfeit money. वापिस तो कहे विप्र मम नाही, ब्राह्मण ने कहा मेरा नहीं है, तेरा तेरा यों कहत भई कलह दुह माई. फिर लड़ाई हुई. मथुरा भासी विप्र ने मारियो बहुत सर्राफ, बहुत लोग विनती करी तऊ करी नहीं माफ. भाई एक सर्राफ कौ आया गौ इस बीच, मुख मीठी बातें करे चित कपटी नर नीच. तिन बाभन के वस्त्र सब टकटोहे करी रीस, लखे रुपया गांठी में किनी देखे 25. When he frisked the Brahman, he found 25 rupees. सबके आगे फिरी कहे, गैर साल सब दर्व. All this is counterfeit money, was showing. Kotwal, by now I think people had come to watch. कोतवाल पे जाए के नजर गुजारी सर्व. सब लोग जाओ और कोतवाल को बताओ कि ये हो रहा. Then Banarsi writes that what the Sarraf did was that actually he went home, changed the 25 rupees into counterfeit money or bad money, and went to the Kotwal. खरे दाम घर में धरे, खोटे ले आऊं जोड़ी, मिही कोथली माही भरी, in a bag, दीनी गाठी मरोरी. Sarrafs, when they put a stamp on a bag, it is very it has a high degree of trustworthiness. Tavernier says that in some cases the bag would circulate for months without being opened because it carries the stamp of a sarraf. लिए कोथली हाथ में कोतवाल पे जाई, खोटे दाम दिखाए के कही बात समझाई. साहब जी ठग आए घने, फैले फिरही जाही नाही गने, संध्या समय होही एक ठौर, हवे असबार करहु सब दौड़. So this is the most interesting part. The charge he brought against Banarsi Brahmins was that they were thugs. It was a very clever charge because the penalty, the punishment for possessing or circulating counterfeit money in Mughal India was mild, whereas the punishment for thuggy was execution. In different stages, but depending on the discretion of the investigating officers. So the stages of reprimand and caution are usually passed over, and so the charge was that they were thugs. यह कह बनिक निरालो भयो, कोतवाल हाकिम पे गयो. The कोतवाल went to the फौजदार. बात कही हाकिम के कान, हाकिम साथ कियो दीवान. The फौजदार sent a divan. I think the Faujdar was a very sensible officer, as we will see. कोतवाल दीवान समेत सांझ समय आए ज्यों प्रेत, पुरजन लोग साथी से 100 अब 400 लोग हो चुके थे गांव के, जनू सराय में आई धारी. बैठे दो खाट बिछाई. Now this is a trial which is going on, investigation or trial. The police chief Kotwal and the revenue officer Diwan. बैठे दो खाट बिछाई, बाभन दो लिए बुलाई, पूछे मुगल कहू तुम कौन, कहे विप्र मथुरा मम भौन. Now this is another interesting response of identity. When they were asked, the Brahman said, we are from Mathura. So the identity of the place they came from was their primary identity at this stage, which they thought they should communicate first. फिर महेसरी लियो बुलाए, कह तो जाही कहाँ सो आई, तब सो कहें जौनपुर गांव, कोठीबाल आगरे जाओ. So the Maheswari was also asked the same question. Where are you coming from and where are you going? And he said, I'm coming from Jaunpur and I'm going to Agra. फिरी बनारसी बोले बोल, मैं जौहरी करो मनी मोल. I am a jeweler and I dabble in the business of gems. Koti hoti Banarsi mahi, I have my shop in Banaras. I have my shop in Banaras. अब हम बहुरी आगरे जाएं. साझी ने, and now this is a very interesting verse. साझी नेमा साहू के तख्त जौनपुर भौन. We are partners of Nema Sahu, who was a big merchant in Agra and in whose family firm Banarsi was a factor. साझी नेमा साहू के तख्त जौनपुर भौन, व्यापारी जग में प्रकट ठक्के लक्षण कौन. कही बात जब बनारसी, तब वे कहन लगे पारसी. Then they started talking among themselves in Persian. एक कहे ये ठग तहकीक, एक कहे व्यापारी ठीक. So now there was a disagreement between the two officials. One of them, the Diwan, the Kotwal, was saying they are actually thugs. हकीकत में ठग हैं. And the Diwan was saying no, they are merchants. कोतवाल तब कहे पुकारी, बांधू बेग करहू क्या रारी. बोले हाकिम को दीवान, अहमक कोतवाल नादान, राती समय सूझ नहीं कोई, चोर साहू की निरख न होई. So in short, the Diwan prevailed and said, look, postpone this because it's night time, you can't take any decisions, wait till the morning, and in the morning we will find out the truth of their identity. Banarsi writes that the night was very long, something like 6 months. And they were tossing and turning and talking and thinking what was going to happen. And something really bad happened first thing in the morning when they saw that laborers were carrying stakes, wooden stakes, suli, for them. And in fact, one of the officials of the Pargana said to them that these are for you. So not a very comforting thought. So what was happening in the night, that in the middle of the night, Maheswari had a flash of memory. The Kotwal had earlier told them that you have to verify your identity. So this is another interesting phenomenon. How do you verify your identity? There were no papers. Even now there are no papers. Some people say we will never have papers. We will never show papers. So how do you establish your identity? The Mughal had, and this we know from Banarasidas and a couple of other sources, that the Mughal had a outstanding rule. The identity has to be verified by a third person, not by the official, not by the person who is being interrogated, but by a third person, a person whose identity is already established. कोतवाल तब कहे बखानी, तुम ढूंढो अपनी पहचानी. The onus of proof is on you. कोर्रा घाटमपुर अरुबरी, तीन गांव की सरियती करी. I have jurisdiction over these three villages, कोर्रा, घाटमपुर and बरी. और गांव हम मान ही नहीं, तुम ये फिक्र करहु हम जाही. चले मुगल बादाबदी भोर, चौकी बिठाई चाहू और. So in the middle of the night, Maheshwari remembered that in Bari village he had somebody he knew. His brother was married in the village, his younger brother. पहर राती जब पिछली रही, तब महेश्वरी ऐसी कही, मेरो लहुरा भाई हरी, नाव सो तू ब्याहा है बरी. हम आए थे यहाँ बारात, भली याद ये आई बात. बनारसी कहे, रे मूढ़ ऐसी बात करी क्यों गूढ़. बनारसी बात was very crossed with him कि अभी तक क्यों नहीं बताई ये बात. कहे महेश्वरी यों कहे, भय सौ भूली मोही. Out of fear my memory stopped, my mind stopped working. अब मौकों सुमिरन भई, अब इस मौके पे मुझे याद आ गया है से, तुम निश्चिंत रहो अपने मन में. Then in the morning, when the officials were told this, the diwan stopped the kotwal from going to that village and said, I will go with Maheshwari. And the two went, their identity was verified. They came back, and Banarsi heard something which filled him with joy, inasmuch as joy here means relief from pain. दो जने बारी में गए, समधी मिले साहू सब भये. साहू साधु घर कियो निवास, आयो मुगल बनारसी पास. आई कहियो तुम साचे साहू, कहरु माफ ये भया गुनाहू. तब बनारसी कहें सुभाव, तुम साहिब हाकिम उमराव. अरे आप तो साहब हाकिम उमराव हैं. जो हम करम पुरातन कियो, हमने जो पिछले जन्म में काम किए थे उसी की सजा मिली है हमें, आपकी कोई गुनाह और खता नहीं. So this is an interesting episode of whatever we can know about how Mughal administrative apparatus works at this level, at this local pargana level, a big village level. How people are charged or falsely charged, what is the crime and how severe is the punishment, how is the matter investigated, and finally turning on the question of verification of identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Najaf Haider. It was a fantastic lecture. And thank you for reading out the passages from the original because they are much more interesting. Uh, uh, there are a number of translations, as you pointed out. In fact, I have the translation which has been done by Mukund Lat. But as you pointed out, that there are certain, passages which you have retranslated in a better fashion. Thank you for putting up those things before us. Now, before I have a few queries myself, but before that, let us put up certain questions which have been put to you by our audience. The first question is by Dr. Syed Ali Kazim. We rely heavily on Persian sources. What is the new thing which we get from Banarasi Das so far as eastern part of Mughal Empire is concerned, which are missing in Persian sources of the same period. Of course, the amalgamation of Persian and Hindavi words are remarkable in Ardhakathanak.
Um, it is true that we rely, when I'm talking about myself, mostly on Persian sources. Uh, Not only because they are in plenty, but also because we're trained to read these sources. But it's not as if we do not know anything about the eastern part of the empire, and by east I mean eastern UP or Jaunpur and places like that. I'm not going up to Bihar and Bengal. My friend Ejaz Hussain has written a book on Jaunpur, Sharqi kingdom of Jaunpur, and you can see that it's full of Persian sources. Surely, uh, if you compare the description of places like Agra or Delhi, Shahjahanabad, um, what we can call central places, compared to that, of course, there is less coverage of Jaunpur, but Jaunpur has had a very distinguished um, uh, group of ulama or scholars whose biographies have been written, who have also written about the city. Um, so we can gather some information about. The best thing about Banarsi Das's account is that there is a graphic description of Jaunpur, the place, the people, the professions. Um, so I would still prefer Banarsi Das's for the ground reality of the city than other. As I said, it is possible to verify from Persian sources what was happening in Jaunpur. So we know uh, from a very rarely read source that Salim gave Lala Beg Kabuli, who later became Jahangir Quli Khan, the Jagir of Jaunpur, independently of Akbar. And he gave Jagirs to many of his loyalists. That was the way. To his Jagirs were essentially in the area of Agra. So what he did was to forgo those Jagirs and take Jagirs in Allahabad and Jaunpur area. All this we know from Persian sources. So in fact, Banarsi Das's discussion of 1600 and possibility of uh, a war in the region has a very interesting backdrop, which is possible only if you piece together. This is the time when Abul Fazl is just finishing his Akbarnama. 1602 he was murdered, and the book stops, obviously. But 1600 he's writing. There are other sources where you have Chin Kolich Khan's biography can be reconstructed, and this is what I'm doing these days actually, with Persian sources, including Jahangir's night sessions, Majalis-e Jahangir, where there is a discussion of Chin Kolich Khan and his brother Lahori because of who he lost his life. So I would agree that the eastern part of the country, or other areas, so-called marginal areas, where the chronicles are not very detailed. Um, that's why we have alternative sources, and I am reading Banarsidas in conjunction, not in opposition to Persian sources. That is my methodology. I do not think that language is important. I think what is being said in a language is more important than the language itself. So for me, historical content is far more important than the issue of language. Insofar as the language allow understanding of the language allows you to have a better interpretation of an event, of course language is important.
Well, you rightly pointed out, Professor Heather, that the type of information which is available in sources like Kathanak are complementary to the information which we get from the Persian sources. But along with that, Ali Kazim, we should also remember that most of the popular Persian sources are the official chronicles on which we have based our histories. Whereas, these biographies, autobiographies of people like this merchant Banarasidas, they tell you about the condition which is happening at the local level, which Abul Fazl is not going to write about. Uh, you know, uh, Similarly, we have, although as Najaf pointed out, that these are in a non-Persian local dialect, local language. But even in Persian, there are letters like, for example, those written by Balkrishnan Brahman. I mean, they grapple with situation which the official sources and chronicles would never mention. I mean, writing Sifarishi letters, writing about the problems of the family, the social crisis which is going on, and so on and so forth. So I think that we have depended enough on the chronicles and the official records. Now is the time that if we want to study about the Mughal society as such, we would have to depend on these non-official, sources like Ardhakathanak and the letters which survive from that period. There is a question by Shamoon Ahmad, very interesting, and it's a comment as well as a question. Very interesting and illustrative lecture. It sensitizes us how useful are vernacular sources for getting some very significant information. Yes, congratulations and regards to Professor Najaf Haider. Uh, can you tell me which is earliest source where the word Mughal is used for the family of Babur? I mean, again, here the term Mughal is being used. So
Ha.
yeah.
The earliest I think is Bayezid Bayad's Tarikh Humayun wa Akbar, which is a late 16th century source. But if the Mughals are mentioned as Mughals in an earlier source, I'll be very happy to read that. That's the earliest I have come across, and the reference is very interesting. The word Mughal was never used by the imperial family. They never called themselves Mughals. We called them Mughal. Indians called them Mughals. The word was used frequently during the Sultanate period for Mongols. Mongol is the anglicized word for Mughal. When we say Mongol, we immediately transport it back to the 13th century. And when we say Mughal, we come back to the 16th century. But actually, the term Mughal is used in Barni and many other sources for the Mongol hordes which are attacking India. And I think there is a continuity in the use of the term, because Mughals were also seen, the Mughals of India, Baburids, as they are called in Central Asia. In Central Asia, they are called Baburids. They are seen as the same hordes of invaders and attackers. which came earlier from India. It is only when the Mughals settle down and people know that they are not that bad, that the term then is used in the sense of a Central Asian or Turani person, like in this book and in many other in other Persian languages book. A person who was from Central Asia, who spoke Persian but could also speak Turkish, who was not an Iranian. Earlier, the term Tajik was used as opposed to Turk, but in this period, that is to say, in the 16th and 17th century, the term Mughal is used in the sense of a noble of Central Asian lineage, at least in the Ardha.
Well, I will add to that if you Najaf had been talking about the self perceptions, with the self perception of this dynasty, whom we call as Mughal, was that they are Chahtais. I mean, take Babar Nama for example. Babar takes pride in the fact that he is a Turk, and he talks about safeguarding, securing wherever there are inhabitants of the Turkish origin living. He says that please don't disturb them. They are the Turks, just like me. He finds the Mughals or Mongols, uncouth, uncivilized. So, as Najaf pointed out, that in their self-perception, at least the early Mughals, they never labeled themselves as Mughal. They called themselves as Chagtais. They also took pride in the fact that they are Timurids. It is only the others who started calling them as the Mughal, especially so the European travelers' accounts. The term Great Mughal, which has been given by the Europeans, not by the Mughals themselves. So this is a question which is very interesting. But as Najaf also pointed out, that if you go to Central Asia, there the term which is being used for them is Baburid. So there are, different terms through which, but at least, as he pointed out, that it was only during the period of Akbar that for the first time that we hear some, official chronicle using the term Mughal for the Mughals. There is another question by Dr. Sayyid Ali Kazim. Jaunpur had witnessed a tumultuous period in history. From being the Shiraz-e-Hind, it was snatched away by the Lodhis and finally by the Mughals. Do we find any kind of lamentation or anger by Banarasidas for this loss of eminence for Jaunpur?
Difficult question. Banarsidas's imagination of Jaunpur is not the same as ours. For us, Jaunpur was some kind of a cultural center or cultural capital of the East. And that is the title of Ejaz's book, Shiraz-e-Hind. That was not the impression that Banarsidas's Ardhakathanak gives to us. He sees Jaunpur as his hometown, of course, also as a city where with a mercantile population, where his father did business, he did business. But we should also remember that Banarsidas spent something like 30 years, 25, 30 years in Agra. And it is Agra that occupies his imagination a lot. Once again, not as administrative center of the Mughal. Of course, when Banarsidas is writing his book, the capital has shifted or is about to shift to 1640s is the time when Shah Jahanabad comes up. and Agra loses its status. But this is not visible in Banarsidas. Banarsidas's reference to the reading of Madhumalti and Mrigavati to people who would come and listen to him is also an indication that there was a culture of reading and recitation, and people were interested in popular literature or popular romances, popular stories, or premakhyans as they are called. So I think the uniqueness of the autobiography is that it allows us access to a world which is somewhat invisible from the kind of sources that we read. There is no reference, and that's why I was a little hesitant to include state in this, because the state is not directly encroaching upon Banarsi Das's imagination. There's hardly any reference. The only reference which I think, if I'm not mistaken, I get of Agra is that there was a Karori who came and took away Banarsi Das's earnings in tax, and he laments. Otherwise, this is about business, about ordinary people. Kachori seller who was a member of the audience of Banarsi Das. But regarding Jaunpur, I think the impression that we get, and that is the reason why, to answer your question, is that there is there's no sense of loss of about no nostalgia about Jaunpur losing its. Jaunpur remained the headquarters of the Sarkar. And therefore there was always an administrative setup. And if I can say this, there was trade also in Jaunpur, because Jaunpur was between was at the crossroads of a trade route from the east to the north. But yes, it's a different Jaunpur entirely that we see in the Ardhakathanak.
Well, Najaf, before I take other questions, let me first take up another question by Ali Kazim himself. I mean, he has asked another one. Do we have any other non-Persian sources of around the period which could corroborate facts, for example, the dates being mentioned in Ardhakathanak? I think you have partially answered that, but still, if you would want to add something more to it.
See, there are two types of dates. One are personal dates. Banarsidas says that whatever you have heard from me is a matter of the past. The real story begins from now, and the date is 1556. The date is important for Banarsidas not because it is the date year in which Akbar assumed kingship. It is important because Khadak Sen was born. His father was born. The other date which is important to him is 1586, when he was born. Of course, he has heard all this from his mother and from his father. He has no, and that is the reason why I said that when Banarsidas is discussing his sources, he never mentions that I have read this in this book. It's all based on memory. So these dates are very difficult to corroborate. These are personal dates. Then there are dates of events that are not personal and have a wider context, like the invasion of, or the impending invasion of Salim in 1600. Now that date can be easily corroborated. You just have to read the Akbarnama and you will get a picture, big picture. And then if you go deeper in, read other sources like the second volume of Iqbal Nama-e Jahangiri, which is a history of Akbar and is a rarely read book, has a very interesting discussion of of the machinations of Jahangir as Salim in this area, in this region. This can be corroborated. The death of Kilich Khan is corroborated because Jahangir mentions it in his autobiography and gives the date. I received the news from Jaunpur, Allahabad, Jaunpur, that Kilich Khan is dead. Date of
Well,
death.
hmm,
But
yeah, yeah.
I have another book which I thought I would read out, which is a contemporary Braj biography of versified biography of Jahangir by Keshav Das, called Jahangir Just Chandrika. And I wanted to use it as some kind of a control text to understand the. But I was disappointed with this book, although it's a very celebrated, highly celebrated book, because of the artificiality of the language of the book. Of course, it's written in praise of Jahangir. Some people say there are backhanded compliments and there are negative uh, um, um, innuendos which you can't directly read. I don't know about that. I haven't really deeply studied, just as I did Kathanak. But this book, Keshav Das, can also corroborate. But dates given in Banarasidas Das, like 1605. Now 1605 is a date which we really don't have to verify from. It's the date when Jahangir assumes the throne and there is peace. Banarasidas says that 1605 is the date when Salim becomes the king. He assumes the name of Nuruddin Jahangir, and then peace reigns. So does Keshav Das in his Just Chandrika. So dating, verifying date is a very important, I personally think is a very important work of historians, which is to lay the base or the groundwork to start thinking about an event. And if you do not have a date, then you have to go round and round. But I haven't really come across any book of this nature. It's a unique book which tells you about. And there's another very interesting date, 1596. There is a big famine and people are dying in Jaunpur. Now we know from, you just have to read Professor Habib's Agrarian System of Mughal India, and there's a section on famine where he corroborates the date. He says 1596 there was a great famine in practically the whole of the empire, and which was severe. And Banarsi Das's account of the famine is corroborated to a very large extent, including the date, again from other Persian sources. So I'm afraid the methodology which I used was not to corroborate Banarsi Das with other non-Persian sources, but with Persian sources.
Najaf, I'll now take up a question by Zainab Naqvi. She first of all thanks you, and then she asks the question: how do we look at this source in terms of concept of gender and social relations in the Mughal era? Do we have references to the structure of family and marriage in the autobiography?
Well, I'm glad, Zainab, that you asked this question, and I thank you for that, because gender was the fourth identity which I wanted to discuss. And I was disappointed because women have very shadowy presence in, and that's one way to talk about gender, absence of the agency of women. But having said that, and one example of this is that women have no names, men have names, There is Muldas, there is Khadaksen, there is Banarsidas, there is Narottam, there is Nemi Sahu, Sabal Singh, Benidas, Bandidas, all kinds of men with names, but there is not a single woman who has been identified by name. These are nameless characters. A remarkable feature which we also find in Persian sources. Women are either they are anonymous, or they are identified by their titles, not by their personal or maiden names. It's only by rare good fortune that we come across their maiden names or their um, other names. And this has given to the somewhat wrong impression that women in from Akbar's reign were fading away from the scene. That is not true at all. If you read the sources, and I read a paper in Aligarh on a theme which touches upon this question of agency of women. Now, Banarsidas's story, family is very important. It's extremely important. Even though Banarsi and his father uh, were not on the same page most of the time. Banarsidas's father, Kharak Singh, tried very hard for his son to join the family business. Gave him money, borrowed money to start his startup, if you like. He failed him completely. And there are occasions when Khadak Singh is deeply disappointed. Yet, Banarsi Das has some very strong things to say about family. Why? Because of his mother, of course, who is very close to him, his wife, who helps him not only with her personal saving, but also the savings of his mother, Banarsi's mother-in-law. When Banarsi had completely failed in Agra, was penniless, came back to Khairabad, his sasural. In Khairabad, when his wife asked him about his time in Agra, he told her cock and bull stories, and she said, "No, no, 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 that these stories are not true. Tell me the truth." And then he tells the truth that, "Look, I have nothing." And they put together their lifetime saving to put him back on the saddle. And Banarsi acknowledges this. So, family, and particularly women of the family, have very strong backstage presence in Banarsi Das. Banarsi Das does not talk so much about other families. It is his own family and his wife's family also he talks about. He talks about the death of his grandmother, which was very devastating for him. But you are right that the question of gender and family can be raised, at least with reference to the tenor and information in the Ardhakathanak.
Very correct, Najaf Saab. I think, I mean, uh, there is a general feeling that, as you pointed out, that from the period of Akbar onwards, the women remained invisible as far as the Mughal Empire is concerned. And there's a whole theory that after Akbar, or from the period of Akbar, the women were in fact not being mentioned. They were not there in the society, and so on and so forth. Although, as you rightly pointed out, uh, that this is not the case. I remember your paper in which you tried to argue all this. In Babarnama, we do find a lot of reference, and we do find them taking political decisions. Gulbadan Bano Begum goes on to describe the women within the family, and so on and so forth. We have the case of Jahanara and others where, I mean, they appear to be active. But this is yet again a topic on which there is much work which should be done, and somehow, I mean, this whole suspicion that women were hidden during the period of Akbar onwards is something which I think needs research to be negated. There is a question by Abdullah Raza. Uh, could you please throw some light on the functioning of council of elders among merchants during the Mughal period? As for instance, Banarsi Das himself once called a council of four elders to resolve his disputes with his enemies.
Yes, thank you for that question. There is some very interesting information on what one can call council of elders or assembly of elders. The word which is used in Banarsidas as elsewhere is panch. And it does not mean five people because, as you rightly said, in Banarsidas' case, there were only four. But he nevertheless uses the word panch, which means that it's an assembly or it's a council, which commands respect and trust, and the verdict given by the council is binding on both the parties. This is a personal dispute, by the way. This is not a mercantile dispute. There was a man, Banarsidas does not identify, he would not like to identify certain things, and he himself says that certain things should not be told. uh, um, who came in their lives, in the life of both Narottam and Banarsi, and gave them a lot of trouble and also squeezed money from them. And it was Banarsi Das's friendship with Chin Kulich Khan, the Faujdar of Jaunpur, which uh, gave the enemy, um, बनारसी दास calls him मेरे पिछले जन्म का दुश्मन था वो. तो इस जन्म में भी दुश्मन है. तो he says that when people came to know about his friendship with the Faujdar, the enemy became apprehensive, and then people said, let us resolve this dispute, and they appointed four people, and the dispute was resolved. But this is a personal, in my understanding. There were mercantile disputes which were invariably resolved by a assembly of merchants, also called panch, sometimes headed by the Nagar Seth, who is the civil head of the city, and not the administrative head. He has nothing to do with the. At one point of time, the Mughal state tried to incorporate the institution, but to a large extent, it was an independent institution. It is only rarely that when a tribunal like this does not give the desired outcome, they go to the court or adalat of the qazi, hakim, which is beginning with Faujdar of Pargana or sub-district, and of course governor or subedar, who is also called hakim nazim. And we have some very interesting references to that. But a short answer to this question is that one distinct feature of the mercantile community of Mughal India was that they resolved their disputes through these traditional customary institutions rather than having to go to the state.
Well, now I'll take up the question by Dr. Rohma Javed Rashid of Jamia. She asks, polyglossia has been used to describe the linguistic world of medieval India, suggesting that linguistic communities as such did not exist. Why then did Anand Ram Mukhlis feel the need to translate the Padmavat into Farsi for his Persianate audience? How important do you think was the distinction between refined, urbane, and rustic provincial languages, if at all it existed?
Well, there was a difference, of course. You read Keshav Das's Jahangir's Just Chandrika, and you read Banarasidas Ardhakathanaka, and you can see the difference. Keshav Das is a literary Braj uh, um, book. And he's very conscious that it was going to be read by people of a certain taste and status. This is not the case with Banarsidas. He wants people to read his book, by the way. And he says that मित्रों कान धर के सुनो जो मैं कहने वाला हूं एक दिन मन में आही बात कहूं आपनी कथा विख्यात. Now, all these references suggest that he was not writing it for himself. He was writing his autobiography to be read, but read by a certain kind of people, not by people of literary finesse and taste. For them, he also wrote other books. Now, the interface between Persian and Hindi is, of course, something which I am greatly interested in. And you are right in saying that, if you are saying that there are less cases of Hindi getting translated into Persian than Sanskrit and other than Sanskrit texts, important Sanskrit texts. There are less, of course, cases of Persian works being translated into Hindi or Sanskrit. So there is a certain hierarchy of translation. Before Anand Ram Mukhlis, Abdul Quddus Gangohi translated the Chandayan into Persian, and in the Lataif-e Quddusi, the book unfortunately is lost, and this is 16th century, early 16th century, 1540s. Fragments of this translation have survived, and we know that. Then somebody else translated the whole book and gave it a Persian name. I'm forgetting the name of that person. So the idea was to for people, there were of course different audiences, there's no doubt about that. Although, as I said, most Indians were bilingual. Banarsidas was trilingual or multilingual or a polyglot, but there were people who preferred a particular kind of language or literature. This is also true. And the higher up you go, the deeper this preference becomes. I'm not saying that they were not interested in. Jahangir says that a poet came to my court and who composed a kabit in my praise, and he also gives the composition. But that is just, you read Majalis-e Jahangiri and you can see what kind of hair splitting is done in Persian literature in the book. So obviously there was a preference. Now, if we disregard this high Persianate culture, which is very important for us to understand how people communicated at the lower level, then of course Hindi is a very important source. The reason why, after Amir Khusro, who wrote only in Persian, there is no Hindi kalam of Amir Khusro that exists. There are so many claims. After Amir Khusro, people started writing in Hindi, one after another. That is a very, very striking phenomenon. They are writing love poems, epic poems, stories, not in Persian, but in Hindi. Chandayan, Mrigavati, Madhumalti, Padmavat, many other books written in the 17th century, beginning with the late 14th century Chandayan. This is a unique phenomenon. And this allows us to look at, and I'm not surprised that Banarsi is not reading singing verses from Madhumalti and Mrikavati in Agra, when he had completely lost interest in business. So this interface is, I think, very important, because in this interface there is no inhibition about language. There are no strict protocols. The language is flexible, as we can see in the Ardha, gives the writer tremendous latitude to coin terms, to coin expressions, to rhyme by borrowing expressions from different lexicons. So I would agree with you that there is a graded way of looking at the various types of audiences. At the top, you have very high and mighty Persianate reading population, who sometimes converse in Hindi also. Farid Bukhari Murtaza Khan, who was a high-ranking noble of Akbar and Jahangir, says in one of his conversations, when people asked him, "Why are you giving so many Madad-e-Maash grants?" As if saying you are wasting the money, state's money, he says, "Aag laganti jhopdi jo nikla so labh." That's what he says. He doesn't cite a verse from Sadi or Hafiz. This is a Hindi expression कि जो ये दुनिया तो आग लगी झोपड़ी है, इसमें से जितना भी निकाल के खैरात कर दो वो it's gain. So that's why I'm not treating them in and I'm also sensible to the presence of Hindi in the life of these very refined people who patronize. And Abdur Rahim Khan Khana is a very good example, that he patronizes both Persian poets and writers as well as Hindi writers.
Yes, you are quite correct. I mean, there are a large number of such evidences in Zakhirat al-Khawanin, where a number of muhavras, Hindavi muhavras, have been cited. Zakhirat al-Khawanin, as you know, is the biography of nobles, and their lives have been discussed. And in between, the author keeps on giving us the Hindavi names as well as the muhavras which are used for certain things. So it is, I think, something which we should remember when we discuss the Mughal society as such, that it was not a society where only Farsi was being spoken and at the top, but there were, I mean, certain registers, popular registers of language development, which were taking place during that period. Najaf, I'm really very thankful to you. I mean, more than 2 hours, 7 minutes have gone by, and there are still certain questions. I just don't know what to do, but still, I would put up one question which has been asked by Muhammad Aftab Alam. And he asked, what about the extrapolation of the events put in biographies and autobiographical accounts? I think we would close with this question, and I'll just take 2 minutes of yours after this.
There is always this charge that autobiography has an element of design as opposed to truth. And that since writers, autobiographers are conscious that people are going to read about their lives, they sometimes take liberty. Now, that is to some extent true. It is different from writing diary. In a diary, you write the event of the day as it has happened, and you do not change. You go on adding, but you do not change. Whereas in an autobiography, you have the means to go back in time and make things happen, which either have not happened or have happened differently. So I agree. In Banarasidas, these extrapolations are innocent. For instance, he uses the term Jagir for a time period when the term was not used. Early 16th century. we know that the term has a history, but many people use the term Jagir. And when he is writing in 1641, obviously Jagir is a very important institution. So he uses the term, and he thinks that his readers will understand. So there are some innocent slipping in reminiscences. For instance, he puts a date to his father Khadak Sen's joining the service of the Bengal Sultan when Suleiman Karrani was not there, 1565. It is only in 1565 that he comes to the throne, whereas Rai Dhanna, who must have been the diwan of the previous sultan. So there are, of course, these are recollections in which he's slipping, but these are innocent slippages. These are not deliberate uh, um, um, extrapolations to constitute an argument. So by and large, I think Banarsi's autobiography is based on truth. It's a truthful recollection, and as I said, it gets denser and thicker as you move in time. When it comes to his own time period, then it has more details. His more things are more securely dated, and that is only to be expected because he knows and he remembers and maybe writes. There is no particular extrapolation of event as far as I understand in Banarsi Das's all major events, and by major I mean events which can be studied outside the autobiography in other sources, are have happened when they happen. Like as I said, I gave you 4 or 5 dates, which all of them are validated from external sources.
Well, Najaf, I'm really excited. It's 2 hours and 12 minutes, and you have been with us. I had a number of questions, but then possibly we would discuss it sometime afterwards in some other session. This is Ardha Kathanak is a source, is an autobiography which needs much deliberation. You talked about the different registers of identity as far as Banarsidas is concerned. I think you missed out on one, and that is of him being end of his life. you know,
Yeah.
and then the episode when he catches that disease. I mean, that also tells us much about the society. Let me assure the audiences that there is much, much more in this autobiography that has been discussed by Najaf Haider, and all of it is very, very interesting. In fact, sometimes it reads like a novel. Uh, but one thing which all of you should remember is that autobiography, which we take so lightly today, I mean, was not something which was very popular during the time when Banarsidas was compiling his own. In fact, that is a rare occasion when a merchant writes his own autobiography in such a fashion. Just like it is a very rare phenomenon that Babur, a prince, would write his autobiography, Babarnama. Both these texts, Babarnama and Ardhakathanak, both of them have this importance that they are excellent pieces. No other prince, in fact, contemporary prince of Babur's time, wrote his own autobiography in the fashion which Babur did. Babur also went on to mention his weaknesses, his weak moments. The author of Ardhakathanak also does the same. One writes in Turkish, which gets translated into Persian, The other writes in Hindavi. He writes in a language which was spoken and understood by the common people of the area in which he was living. Thank you, Najaf, for enlightening us about the various aspects of Ardha as a source of history. In fact, let me just in the last sentence just say that in order to write the history of Mughals, sources like Kathanak are crucially very, very important. I would now hand over to Shagufta Siddi, who would thank formally Professor Najaf Haider.
Thank you, Professor Heather. I can't thank you enough for today. It is very engaging, and thank you for introducing us to the remarkable autobiographical poem. It's actually a poem, right, by Banarasidas, and the way you talk about him as Banarsi, it's so relatable. So the characters or the dramatis personae of this source are so relatable. They don't even feel far removed in time. And the references that you mentioned to pilgrimages and mannats for an offspring, the sadhus and the charlatans, the lovers and emperors, the villains that you've mentioned, all the references to metaphysics, the storms, violence, village of thieves, chaotic situations, and bribing of course. सो आज मकर की चांदनी तो नहीं है, लेकिन आपने अर्धकथानक पर प्रकाश डाला, उसके लिए हम आपके बहुत शुक्रगुजार हैं. And I just want to emphasize on this that our collaboration with ASHA aims to bring lesser known, unexplored aspects of history to history enthusiasts. Now, these are non academic general audience and scholars alike. We want to thank Professor Nadeem Razavi for curating two such series that are very important, and I'm sure that they will go down in sort of spreading the word in the times of WhatsApp universities. Now, I want to talk to you about also share what is going to happen next weekend. So, about our upcoming programs on Friday, the 11th, at 7 p.m., we have the sources of medieval history. For the sources of medieval history, we have Dara Shukur's Majmaul Bahrain with Supriya Gandhi, and she's going to be talking to us all the way from New Haven. And on Sunday, sorry, the 13th, the absolutely fantastic Eba Kosh will be presenting an illustrated talk on Agra as it was, the Garden of Princess Jahanara, also at 7 p.m. So both these are at 7, Friday at 7 and Sunday at 7. We look forward to your continued participation and support. And thank you so very much again, both of you. 2 hours, 17 minutes have passed, and it didn't feel like a second.
Well, Shagufta, and the poem which you read out, Supriya is on 11th of December. So soon after Najaf, we have Dr. Francesca Orsini on 6th of December, and she will be speaking on before the Hindi Urdu divide. So she will be there first, and after that would be Supriya Gandhi. And friends, remember that Francesca Orsini is an awesome scholar, and please be there on 6th of December. Although all of us know the import of that date, but on that date, instead of talking about other fragmenting matters, we will be discussing about the topic before Hindi Urdu divide. This is just as a reminder. Thank you, Professor Najaf Haider. Thank you, Shagufta. And
Thank you.
thanks all of you for encouraging us, listening to us. I hope that through these lectures you would understand who the Mughals were. We didn't have a past where there were only clashes, but we were normal human beings, a normal society with all type of things thrown in between. So please keep on hearing us. Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Good night, everyone.
Thank
See you
you.
on Sunday at 7. Good night.